Even a king who rules the night cannot control the moment his heart begins to burn. Lucian Blackwood had lived 3 centuries without warmth, without hesitation, without a single moment of weakness, and yet now he stood at the edge of his own control, watching a fragile human girl breathe, like she was fighting the cold itself, her body trembling beneath layers of silk that cost more than she had ever seen in her life. Her name was Emily Carter, and she was never meant to matter. Rewind. Just 48 hours earlier, the cathedral doors had opened to a storm that seemed to bow to him. Thunder rolling low as if the sky itself feared what stood beneath it. Lucian didn't look at the bride. When she walked down the aisle, he didn't need to. He already knew what she was. Poor, desperate human chosen not for love, but for a contract signed in ink that smelled faintly of iron and rain. She was there to settle debts. Nothing more. The court watched in silence, nobles in black and silver waiting for her to stumble, waiting for proof that she didn't belong. But Emily didn't trip, didn't cry, didn't beg. She simply walked forward step by step until she stood before the throne where a king did not kneel for anyone. You understand the terms. Lucian said, his voice low, steady, final. She nodded. Yes, your majesty. No trembling, no hesitation, just quiet acceptance. And for the first time in years, something almost imperceptible flickered in his gaze. Not interest, not yet, but something that refused to be ignored. The ceremony was short. No vows, no promises, just a binding sealed under ancient law. When she reached for the pen, her hand brushed his for less than a second. A human mistake, insignificant, except the air shifted instantly. The candles flickered not out, but lower, as if something unseen had drawn breath across the room. Lucian's eyes snapped to her wrist. Nothing visible, nothing that anyone else could see, but he felt it, a reaction, faint but real, like heat beneath ice. The council noticed his pause, whispers spreading like smoke, but he said nothing. Not yet. After the ceremony, he turned away. Without another glance, the marriage was done. The girl would be placed in the West Wing, away from the court, away from him, where she would live quietly, forgotten. That was the plan. That was how it always worked. But Emily Carter did not disappear the next morning. She was seen in the lower halls, not lost, not confused, just moving carefully, as if learning the rhythm of a place that had never welcomed her. A servant dropped a tray near her, the crash echoing sharp against marble. Everyone froze, waiting for her to flinch, waiting for fear, but she knelt instead, gathering the scattered pieces, her hands steady even as blood beaded lightly along her palm from a broken edge. She didn't react, didn't call for help, just pressed her sleeve against it and continued as if pain was something she had long ago learned to ignore. Lucian watched from the balcony above, unseen, his expression unchanged, but his gaze sharper than before. She should have been afraid. She should have tried to please or to hide, but she did neither, and that was the problem, because for the first time in centuries, something in his perfectly ordered world had begun to move, and he did not yet understand why the castle learned her name before she ever spoke it aloud, not because she announced herself, but because of the silence she left behind. Wherever she walked, Emily Carter did not move like someone who feared the place she had been brought into. She moved like someone who had already survived. Worse, the servants noticed first how she thanked them for things they were never thanked for, how she stepped aside instead of expecting others to move, how she folded her own blankets, even though no one had asked her to. Lucian noticed something else entirely. She did not try to understand him. She did not watch him the way others did, with calculation or fear. She simply existed as if his presence did not demand her attention, and that was new, that was wrong. On the third night, a quiet disruption spread through the East Wing, a soundless distress that only those with heightened senses could feel. The prince, the hidden one, the child no one spoke about, had not settled. For days his condition, unchanged, his presence tolerated, but never embraced. Lucian stood at the threshold of the sealed corridor, listening not to sound, but to absence, the absence of calm, the absence of balance. And then something shifted, faint but undeniable. He stepped forward faster than thought, the doors already opening before any command was spoken. Inside the chamber, dim and untouched, Emily stood beside the small bed, her back straight, her movements careful, not hesitant, not afraid. The child at her arms had gone still, not lifeless, not worse, but different. The tension that always surrounded him had softened like winter, giving way to the first hint of spring. Lucian did not speak. He watched her Fingers adjust the thin blanket around the boy the way she held him close, without pressing too tightly, as if she understood a rhythm no one had taught her. You should not be here. His voice cut through the room. Low, controlled, final. She turned slowly, not startled, not defensive, just aware. I heard him, she said quietly. He sounded alone, no apology. No excuse, just truth. The guard behind Lucien shifted, uncertain, waiting for an order that did not come. The child stirred slightly, his small hand tightening weakly around the fabric of her sleeve. And then it happened. His breathing, even not fully healed, not cured, but steadier than it had been in years, the air responded, the unseen layers of ancient power within the walls reacting in a way Lucien had not felt since long before this era began. The council arrived moments later, drawn by the disturbance, their eyes sharp, their voices controlled, but edged with something deeper: interest, suspicion, calculation. What is she doing here? One of them asked already, stepping forward, but Lucien moved first, not with force, not with anger, just presence enough to stop the question from becoming action. She is under my protection, he said, and the words landed heavier than they should have, because they were not part of the plan. Emily lowered her gaze, slightly, not submissive, not challenging, simply respectful, as she placed the child gently back onto the bed, her hand lingering for a brief second longer than necessary, as if confirming something only she could feel. When she stepped back, the room felt colder again, not wrong, just empty of whatever warmth had existed while she stood there. Lucien felt at the absence like a quiet echo, and for the first time in centuries he understood something dangerous. This was no longer just a contract. This was no longer something he could observe from a distance, because the moment she walked past him without hesitation, without fear, he realized the one thing he had always controlled was already slipping away. The council did not leave quietly. They never did, even in silence. Their presence pressed against the walls like a storm waiting for permission to break, and Emily felt it. The moment she stepped back into the corridor, the air colder, heavier, as if the castle itself was watching her now, not as a guest, not as a servant, but as something undefined, something that did not fit into the order that had existed for centuries. She should have been escorted away immediately. That was the rule. Humans did not walk unguarded through royal halls, especially not after interfering with something the court had long accepted as unchangeable. But no one moved, not even the guards, because Lucien had not given the order, and that absence of command was louder than any decree ever spoken. He stood just inside the chamber, still watching the child, whose breathing had settled into a fragile rhythm, and then his gaze shifted not to the council, not to the guards, but to her. You will remain in the West Wing, he said finally, his tone controlled, measured, as if nothing had changed, as if the world had not just tilted beneath his feet. Emily nodded. Once, I understand. No argument, no fear, just acceptance again, always acceptance, and that unsettled him more than defiance ever could. She turned to leave, her steps quiet against the marble floor, but before she reached the end of the corridor, one of the council members moved forward, her voice smooth, but edged with something sharper. This is a mistake, Your Majesty. The girl is not normal. She should be examined, observed. Contained. The word lingered longer than it should have, and Emily paused, not because she was afraid, but because she recognized something in that tone, something she had heard before in a different life. When people talked about things they did not understand, Lucien did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The temperature in the corridor dropped by degrees, the kind of cold that did not touch the skin but settled deeper into the space between words. She is not yours to decide, he said, and the finality in it left no room for negotiation. The council member inclined her head, but the look in her eyes did not fade. This is larger than preference, she replied quietly. If she can influence the prince, then she can influence more. We must know what she is. Lucien held her gaze for a fraction longer than necessary, then turned away. The conversation over, not dismissed, not resolved, just ended. Because he said so, and that was the kind of authority that had ruled for centuries. Emily continued walking, not looking back, not waiting for permission, because none was given and none was needed. When she reached the West Wing, the doors closed behind her with a soft echo that felt louder than it should have. The room prepared for her was far beyond anything she had known before. Soft fabrics, warm lighting, a bed large enough to feel unfamiliar, but she did not move toward any of it. She stood near the window looking out at the storm that had not fully passed rain, tracing slow lines down the glass, as if the world outside was trying to reach, and her hand rested lightly against the surface, cool, steady grounding somewhere deeper in the castle. Lucien remained where he was long after the council had gone, the chamber empty, except for the quiet breathing of the child and the echo of something he could not yet name. He replayed the moment, not the reaction, not the power, but the way she had held the boy. Without hesitation, without fear, as if she had never been taught that she should be afraid. And that was the problem, because fear created distance, and distance created control, and without it the lines that defined his world began to blur, and for the first time in 300 years Lucien Blackwood did not know where those lines would end. The storm did not leave the castle that night. It settled into the walls, into the silence, into the spaces where something unspoken had begun to grow. Emily did not sleep. She sat by the window long after the candles burned low, her reflection faint against the glass, her hand resting lightly over her wrist where the faintest warmth still lingered, not visible, not painful, just there like a quiet reminder of something she did not understand. Hours passed before she finally moved, not toward the bed, not toward the door, but toward the small table where untouched food had been placed for her. She hesitated for a moment, then carefully wrapped a piece of bread in a cloth, her movements deliberate, as if she already knew where she was going. The corridor outside was empty, no guards, no servants, just the distant echo of a castle that never truly slept. She walked without rushing, her steps steady, her direction certain, as if she had memorized the path. After only one visit, when she reached the sealed wing, the doors did not open immediately. She paused, her hand hovering just above the surface, and for a second, nothing happened. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, the doors shifted just enough to allow her through, as if the castle itself was making a decision. Inside the chamber, the air was still. The child lay where she had left him, his breathing uneven again, not as fragile as before, but no longer calm. Emily moved closer without hesitation, setting the wrapped bread aside as she adjusted the blanket around him, her fingers gentle, precise. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence alone changed the rhythm of the room. Inch by inch the tension eased. The boy's breathing steadied, not instantly, not miraculously, but enough to matter. "You came back." Lucien's voice came from the shadows, not sharp, not angry, just there. Emily did not startle. She turned slightly, her gaze meeting his without flinching. He stood a few feet away, the darkness behind him making his pale features appear almost unreal. "I thought he might need someone," she said simply, no explanation, no defense. Lucien studied her in silence, his eyes searching for something, calculation, intention, fear, but finding none, and that absence unsettled him more than anything else. "You were told to remain in your wing," he said. She nodded. "I know. Then why are you here?" A pause, not long, not uncertain, just enough for truth to form. Because he was alone, the answer landed differently than it should have, not dramatic, not defiant, just honest. And in that honesty, something shifted again. Lucien stepped closer, not invading, not retreating, just enough to see her more clearly, the way she held herself, the way she did not try to impress or hide. "You do not understand what you are involving yourself in," he said quietly. Emily looked down at the child for a moment, then back at him. "Maybe not," she admitted, "but I understand what it feels like to be left without anyone." The room fell still, not cold, not tense, just still, as if the castle itself was listening. And for the first time, Lucien did not have a response, not because he could not speak, but because nothing he knew how to say felt correct, and that was new, that was dangerous, because control came from certainty, and certainty was beginning to slip. The child stirred slightly, his small hand reaching again, finding the edge of Emily's sleeve, as if it had always belonged there. Lucien watched it happen, the connection, subtle, undeniable, and in that moment, something ancient deep within the laws he had followed for centuries began to feel less like truth and more like something incomplete. And he realized, without fully understanding why, that whatever Emily Carter had brought into this place, it was not something he could command. It was something that would change everything, whether he allowed it or not. Morning did not arrive the way it used to in the castle. It did not bring light or warmth, but something quieter, something that settled over the halls like a breath held too long. Emily felt it the moment she opened her eyes, not fear, not danger, just a shift, as If the world she had stepped into was slowly beginning to notice her in return, she sat up slowly, the memory of the night, still fresh, the child's fragile, breathing the way the doors had opened without permission, the way Lucian had looked at her not with authority, but with something he had not yet named. She rose and dressed in silence, the soft fabric unfamiliar against her skin, a reminder that none of this truly belonged to her. And yet she moved through it as if it did not matter. The corridor outside was no longer empty. This time, the guards stood at a distance, not blocking her path, but not leaving it open either. Their presence deliberate, their silence heavier than word. She understood immediately. The rules had changed without being spoken, and yet when she began to walk, they did not stop her. They simply followed 2 steps behind, not escorting, not guiding, just watching. She did not look back. She did not ask why, because she already knew the answer was not meant for her. The castle had begun to pay attention. When she reached the central hall, the shift became undeniable. Conversation, stilled eyes followed her movement, not openly, not disrespectfully, but with a weight that had not been there before. Nobles who had ignored her now observed. Servants who had welcomed her now hesitated, not out of fear, but uncertainty, as if they were trying to understand what she had become without changing at all. Lucian stood at the far end of the hall, speaking with 2 members of the council, his posture unchanged, his presence as controlled as ever, but his attention was not where it appeared to be. The moment Emily stepped into the space, his gaze flickered toward her, just once brief, almost imperceptible, but enough. The council noticed. They always noticed. One of them spoke quietly. Your Majesty, this cannot continue. The girl's influence is already affecting the structure of the court. Lucian did not respond immediately, his eyes still on Emily as she moved through the hall, unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the shift around her. She stopped near a window, adjusting the sleeve of her dress, where the fabric had twisted slightly. Such a small movement, insignificant to anyone else, but not to him, because it was real, uncalculated, untouched by expectation. She is under my protection, he said finally, his voice even controlled, but the words carried something deeper now, not just authority, not just obligation, something that sounded almost like decision. The council member's expression tightened. Protection does not change what she is. Lucian's gaze returned to them slowly, and for the first time, there was something beneath the surface, something that had not been there before, not anger, not defiance, just certainty. Then perhaps you were mistaken about what she is. The words settled into the space between them, heavier than any command. Emily felt it without understanding why, a quiet pull that made her glance up. Her eyes meeting his across the distance. For a moment, neither of them moved, neither of them looked away, and in that stillness, something invisible passed between them, not power, not control, something far more dangerous, because it did not belong to either of them. And for the first time, the court saw it too, not clearly, not completely, but enough to realize that whatever had begun inside these walls, it was no longer something that could be contained. The balance of the castle did not break all at once. It shifted slowly, like a structure that had stood too long without change, and now could no longer hold the weight of something new. Emily felt it in the way doors opened before she reached them, in the way conversations ended. When she entered a room, not out of fear, but awareness, as if every movement she made carried meaning she had never intended. She did not seek attention, she did not seek power, and yet both seemed to follow her without permission. By the afternoon, the tension reached the council chambers, where decisions were no longer whispered but spoken behind closed doors. Lucian stood at the head of the long stone table, his presence still commanding, still absolute, but something beneath it had changed, something quieter, something that did not fit within the rules he had enforced for centuries. She cannot remain unexamined, one council member said, their voice measured, but firm. The influence she has already demonstrated is beyond anything recorded. Lucian did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on an empty space before him, as if replaying something only he could see. The way Emily had held the child, the way the room had responded, the way his own control had faltered for a fraction of a second. She is not an object, he said finally, the words deliberate, precise, a statement rather than a defense. The council member leaned forward. Then define what she is, because she is not ordinary, and if she is not ordinary, then she is either a threat or a resource. The room stilled at that word. Not because it was unexpected, but because of what it implied. Lucien's eyes lifted slowly, meeting each of theirs in turn, and for the first time, there was no distance in his gaze, no cold detachment, just clarity. "She is neither," he said, and the certainty in his voice left no space for interpretation. Outside the chamber, Emily stood, unaware of the discussion, but not untouched by its outcome. The air around her felt heavier, as if something unseen had begun to press closer. She moved through the corridor, toward the sealed wing again, her steps slower this time, not hesitant, but thoughtful, as if she could feel the change without understanding it. When she reached the doors, they opened immediately, no pause, no resistance, as if whatever had hesitated before no longer questioned her presence. Inside, the child was awake, not fully, not clearly, but his eyes were open for the first time, unfocused, uncertain, but aware. Emily stopped just inside the room, her breath catching for a moment before she stepped closer. "You are awake," she said softly, not expecting an answer, not needing one. The boy's gaze shifted toward her, not with recognition, not with fear, just with quiet attention. And when she reached out her hand, hovering just above as the air responded again, not with force, not with light, but with a subtle shift, like something aligning itself to a pattern that had always existed but had never been completed. The door behind her opened without sound. Lucien entered, his presence filling the space, but not disturbing it. His eyes moved immediately to the child, then to her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because words would have been too small for what was happening. The boy's hand lifted weakly, resting against Emily's fingers, not grasping, not holding, just touching. And in that simple contact, something undeniable settled into place. Not a bond, not a command, something deeper, something that did not belong to law or power. And Lucien felt it clearly. This was no longer about control. This was no longer something he could contain. This was something that would force him to choose, not between right and wrong, but between what he had always been and what he was becoming. The moment did not break, it deepened, like a quiet current pulling everything beneath it into a direction no one had prepared for. Emily did not move. Her hand remained where it was, her fingers lightly touching the child's, as if she understood, without being told, that even the smallest shift could change something fragile. The boy's breathing steadied further, his unfocused gaze slowly anchoring not to the room, not to the king, but to her, and that alone was enough to unsettle centuries of certainty. Lucien stood a few feet away, his presence still commanding, still absolute, yet no longer untouched, his eyes fixed on the connection forming before him, not with disbelief, but with something far more dangerous, recognition. He had seen power before, in many forms, ancient rituals, bloodline, awakenings, forces that bent reality itself. But this was different. This was quiet. This was human, and that made it unpredictable. "You should step back," he said finally, his voice low, controlled, but lacking the edge it once carried. Emily did not withdraw. Immediately, she looked at the child once more, as if confirming something, then slowly eased her hand away. The moment her touch left the boy, the room shifted again, not collapsing, not breaking, but losing something. Subtle, something that had existed only in her presence. Lucien felt at the absence, like a door closing softly behind him. The boy's gaze drifted, unfocused, once more, not as distant as before, but no longer anchored. And that was enough to confirm what neither of them had spoken. "You see it too," Emily said quietly, not as a question, but as an observation. Lucien did not answer right away, because acknowledging it would change everything, and once spoken, it could not be taken back. "The council will not ignore this," he said instead, his tone returning to something more familiar, something controlled. Emily nodded. "I know." She glanced toward the door, then back at him. "Will they take him away?" A pause, longer this time, not uncertainty, but calculation. "They will try," he said, truth without comfort. Emily absorbed that without reaction. Her shoulders did not tense, her breath did not quicken. She simply turned back to the child, adjusting the blanket once more, as if the world outside the room had not just shifted around her. "Then we should not let them," she said softly. And that was it. No plan, no strategy, just a statement spoken with the same quiet certainty she had carried since the moment she entered this place. Lucien studied her carefully, searching again for something deeper: ambition, manipulation, fear. But there was none, only resolve, simple, unwavering. And that was what made it impossible to dismiss. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, not rush, not chaotic, but deliberate, the kind that carried authority. Without needing to announce it, the council had come to see for themselves. Lucien's gaze shifted briefly toward the door, then back to Emily, his decision. Forming not in words, but in presence you will stand. Behind me, he said, and this time it was not an order of distance, but of protection. Emily hesitated for the first time, not out of fear, but confusion, then nodded, stepping back, just slightly, not hidden, not removed, just closer to side than before. The doors opened slowly, revealing figures draped in shadow, and silver, their eyes sharp, their attention immediate. And for a brief second the room held its breath, because what stood before them was not just a king and a human, it was something else. Something not yet defined, and therefore far more dangerous than anything they had faced before. The room did not welcome the council, endured them, their presence sharp, precise, calculated, as they stepped inside one by one, eyes adjusting not to the darkness, but to the imbalance. They could already feel something had changed, and they did not like it. Lucien did not move from where he stood, his figure steady between them, and the child, his posture not aggressive, not defensive, just final. Emily remained just behind him, not hidden, not afraid, her presence quieter than theirs, but no less real, and that alone unsettled the careful order they had maintained for centuries. You have allowed this to go too far, one of them said, her voice smooth, but tightened by restraint. The girl has interfered with a condition that has remained stable for decades. Lucien did not react immediately, his gaze fixed ahead, his attention not divided, not uncertain. It was not interference, he said calmly, it was change. The word landed heavier than expected, because it implied something none of them wanted to accept. Change requires understanding. Another voice responded, stepping slightly forward, and we do not have that understanding, which makes her a risk. Emily felt the weight of those words, but did not step back. Her hands rested loosely at her sides, her posture unchanged, as if she had already decided she would not shrink simply because they expected her to. Lucien's voice lowered, not in volume, but in tone enough to shift the air itself. She is under my protection, he repeated, but this time it was not a statement of authority, it was a declaration of position. The council exchanged brief glances, not confused, not surprised, but calculating, and that was when one of them looked past him, not at the child, not at the room, but directly at Emily. Stepped forward, she said, not harsh, not gentle, just expectant. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of fear, but because she understood the weight of what was being asked. Then she moved, stepping into the open space beside Lucien, her presence no longer secondary, no longer behind him, and for a moment, the entire room stilled, not because of her movement, but because of what it represented. You claim no understanding, the council member continued, her eyes fixed on Emily. Then explain what you did. Emily met her gaze quietly. I did not do anything, she said simply. I stayed. He was alone. A pause followed, not because they had not heard her, but because they had not expected the answer to be so small, so human. That is not an explanation, another voice replied, sharper. Now, Emily tilted her head slightly, then answered in the same calm tone, it is the only one I have. Lucien watched the exchange closely, not intervening, not interrupting, because something important was happening, not in the words, but in the space between them. The council was looking for power, for structure, for something they could measure and control, and Emily was offering none of it, only presence, only intention, only something they could not define. The child stirred again, a small movement, barely noticeable, but enough to draw every gaze in the room. His hand shifted slightly toward Emily, not fully reaching, not fully aware, just moving in her direction. And that was when the truth settled into the room, not spoken, not declared, but understood. Whatever she was, whatever this connection meant, it was not something that could be forced or extracted or replicated. It existed only when she chose to be there. Lucien felt it clearly, the line that had always separated control from choice. And for the first time, he realized that the power he had built his world upon did not apply here, not to her, not to this. And the council saw it too, not fully, not comfortably, but enough to know that what stood before them was not a threat to be eliminated or a resource to be claimed. It was something far more dangerous, something that would change the rules simply by existing. The silence did not break when the council finished speaking. It lingered, stretching between them like a boundary no one knew how to cross, because for the first time in centuries the rules they had relied on no longer applied. Lucian felt it with absolute clarity. The shift was no longer subtle. It was no longer contained within a single room or a single moment. It had begun to spread, not through power, not through force, but through something far more difficult too. Controlled choice. Emily stood beside him, still calm, still steady, as if the weight of the room had not changed her at all, and that alone made it impossible to dismiss her as insignificant. The council stepped back, not in defeat, not in agreement, but in recognition. They could not act without consequence, not now, not with the king standing where he stood. One of them spoke again, quieter this time, measured. Then you will take responsibility for what follows. Lucian did not hesitate. I already have the answer. Was simple, final, and carried more weight than any command he had given before, because this time it was not about ruling, it was about choosing. The council did not argue further. They turned one by one, their presence receding from the room, but not disappearing. Their attention would remain, their questions would grow, and the balance of the court would not return to what it had been when the doors closed. The silence returned, but it was different now, not heavy, not tense, just still. Lucian exhaled. Slowly, emotion so small it would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Emily saw it, because she was no longer looking at him as a king. She was looking at him as something else, something human enough to change. The child stirred again, his eyes clearer. Now, his focus returning, not fully, but enough to recognize the presence beside him. His hand moved once more, this time, not searching, not uncertain. It rested lightly against Emily's fingers and stayed. The connection held, not fragile, not forced, just real. Lucian watched it without speaking, because there was nothing left to analyze, nothing left to control, only something to accept. He stepped closer, not to command, not to intervene, but to stand within the space that had formed between them. And for the first time, he did not feel the need to define it. Emily glanced at him briefly, her expression unchanged, but her eyes softer than before, not questioning, not expecting, just aware. The storm outside had finally begun to fade, the faintest light pressing through the edges of the sky beyond the tall windows, not bright, not warm, but different enough to be noticed. Lucian followed her gaze for a moment, then looked back at her. You should rest, he said quietly. Not an order, not a command, just a suggestion. Emily nodded slowly, but did not move immediately, her attention returning to the child, as if making sure he would remain steady without her touch. When she finally stepped back, the room shifted again, not empty, not cold, just quieter, as if something had settled into place rather than disappeared. She moved toward the door, then paused, turning slightly toward him. Thank you, she said, the same words she had spoken before, but this time they carried something more, not obligation, not politeness, something closer to trust. Lucian held her gaze for a moment, longer than necessary, then gave the smallest nod, not as a king, but as a man who understood what had just changed. When she left the room, the door closed softly behind her, leaving him standing beside the child. The silence, no longer empty, but filled with something unfamiliar, something he could not command and could not ignore. And as the first light of a new day touched the edges of a world that had never needed it, Lucian Blackwood understood one simple truth: even the coldest kings are not immune to the warmth they never expected.